The ruling landed like lightning, splitting the silence of a courtroom and sending shockwaves across the nation. Judges, in a unanimous verdict, declared that Starmer's covert plans to align Britain once more with EU regulations were unlawful, not cautious talks, not harmless explorations, a plan, deliberate, binding and concealed. The court's language was merciless, unlawful, undemocratic, secretive. With those words, the mask was ripped away. What many had long suspected but struggled to prove was now written into law, etched into history with the force of the Supreme Court itself. The streets outside Westminster erupted almost instantly. Within minutes of the verdict flashing across television screens, chants began to echo. We voted leave. No betrayal, no lies. Union Jacks waved through the air as furious voices clashed with the cold stone walls of Parliament. The anger was raw, visceral, a fire racing through the veins of a nation long divided, but in this moment, united by rage. Social media exploded with fury. Hashtags condemning Starmer surged to the top of every trending list. Clips of the ruling, with captions branding him a traitor, spread like wildfire, viewed millions of times before the hour was out. Inside Labour headquarters, panic moved faster than order could contain. Advisers scrambled to craft statements that sounded calm but read desperate. MPs whispered in corners, some asking who knew about the scheme and when. Others calculating how quickly the tide of public anger might turn against them personally. Keir Starmer's carefully polished image, months of speeches, promises and claims of competence, cracked open like glass beneath a hammer. For years, he had sold himself as the responsible adult, the steady hand Britain needed after chaos. But with one devastating ruling, that image collapsed. He was no longer the safe pair of hands. He was the man accused of secretly conspiring to reverse Britain's democratic mandate. The Conservative Party, fractured and weakened for months, found sudden, sharp unity. Their MPs flooded television studios with ruthless soundbites. Labour lied. Labour betrayed you. This is an attack on democracy. Their words were sharp enough to cut through every broadcast, every front page, every phone screen. Smaller populist parties seized their moment too. For years, they had warned that the elites would never let Brexit stand. Now they claimed. The proof was undeniable. We told you so, they shouted from podiums and screens. And the people, enraged and betrayed, listened. The scandal was no longer just about Brexit. It had grown into something bigger, darker. If Starmer could do this in secret, what else had been done behind closed doors? What other promises had been broken? What other truths had been buried? Trust in politics itself began to collapse under the weight of suspicion. The fury was no longer directed at one leader or one party. It was aimed at the entire system, a storm tearing through the foundations of British democracy. And at the centre of it all stood Keir Starmer, silent, embattled, isolated. Every minute without an answer felt like guilt. Every hesitation looked like weakness. Every word he tried to offer was dismissed as spin. Every defence condemned as deception. His leadership, once steady, now dangled by a thread, threatened by his enemies, doubted by his allies, and rejected by the public. The bombshell had been dropped. The aftershocks were only beginning, and Britain, stunned and furious, braced itself for what would come next. The fury that erupted in Westminster did not remain contained within London's political walls. Within hours, protests spread like wildfire across Britain. From Manchester to Birmingham, from Newcastle to Bristol, the chant was the same: respect the vote, no betrayal, no lies. Ordinary citizens, some who had not marched in years, poured into the streets in a tidal wave of anger. For Leave supporters, the court's revelation was the ultimate vindication, the proof they had waited for since the referendum. Their warnings, once mocked as paranoia, now stood confirmed in black and white by the nation's highest court. But even Remain supporters, many who had never embraced Brexit, joined the fury. For them, the betrayal was not about leaving or staying. It was about trust, about democracy, about the right of the people to know and to decide. The outrage crossed old divisions and created something far more dangerous: unity in anger. Inside Parliament, the atmosphere was suffocating. Labour MPs sat stiff and pale, phones buzzing non-stop, with messages from furious constituents demanding answers. Constituency offices reported phones ringing off the hook, lifelong party supporters threatening to rip up their membership cards, activists calling for resignations. The whispers of dissent inside the party grew louder, sharper. Questions spread like poison. Who knew about the plan? Who signed off? Who stayed silent? Trust between colleagues began to fracture. Allies eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might break first, who might leap for leadership, who might betray to save themselves. The word coup hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. For Keir Starmer, the silence became unbearable. Every day, without a full explanation, deepened the wound. Every carefully crafted statement came across as hollow. His refusal to face the storm directly looked like fear. His hesitation looked like guilt. His polished calmness, once an asset, now felt like arrogance in the face of public fury. Headlines branded him a coward. Social media mocked him as a traitor hiding in the shadows. Even his allies began to doubt whether he could survive the storm that had broken open above him. The Conservatives pressed their advantage with ruthless precision. For months, they had been plagued by scandals and divisions, but now they smelled blood. Their soundbites were everywhere, sharp and merciless. Starmer betrayed Britain. Labour cannot be trusted. This is the greatest attack on democracy since the referendum. In Leave strongholds, their words hit like thunder. In Remain areas, their warnings found new ground in the anger over secrecy and deception. Smaller populist parties surged forward too, long dismissed as fringe voices, but now roaring into the spotlight. Their message was simple, brutal and effective. We warned you, the elites never intended to respect your vote, and now the proof is here. The media, sensing the scale of the crisis, fanned the flames with relentless intensity. Rolling news played the ruling on repeat, flashing dramatic headlines across screens. Supreme Court exposes Starmer's secret deal. Democracy betrayed. Labour in meltdown. Columnists ripped apart every word of the judgment, dissected every leaked detail, questioned every silence from Labour headquarters. Opinion pages thundered with warnings of constitutional collapse. Online, the outrage took on a life of its own. Hashtags demanding Starmer's resignation stormed to the top of trending lists, amplified by millions of furious voices. Defenders of the Labour leader were drowned out by the unstoppable tide of anger. Every explanation was dismissed as spin. Every plea for calm was branded cowardice. But this scandal was no longer just about one leader or one party. It was devouring faith in politics itself. Ordinary citizens began asking darker questions. If Starmer had done this in secret, what else had been hidden? What other leaders had twisted the rules, bent the truth, cut deals in the shadows? Could any party be trusted again? Suspicion seeped through the cracks of the entire system, poisoning trust in democracy itself. And yet, at the heart of the chaos, one truth rang louder than any chant, sharper than any headline. This was only the beginning. The court had exposed one scheme, but whispers hinted there was more, documents yet unseen, commitments yet undisclosed, revelations waiting to erupt. Britain was not witnessing the end of a scandal. It was standing at the edge of a storm, a reckoning that promised to grow darker, deeper and far more destructive before it was over. As the scandal deepened, the Supreme Court's involvement transformed the crisis from political drama into constitutional earthquake. This was not a passing controversy that could be spun or silenced. It was now a matter of law, principle and survival. Judges made it clear Starmer's actions were not mere political missteps, but violations that struck at the very heart of parliamentary sovereignty. Documents revealed that his team had framed negotiations with the EU not as discussions, but as commitments. That single word carried devastating weight. It suggested intent, binding promises, and deliberate concealment. Legal scholars filled television studios and newspaper columns, declaring that if these documents were accurate, Starmer had not only bypassed Parliament, but had misled the nation itself. The pressure mounted with terrifying speed. Behind closed doors, Labour MPs debated the unthinkable, whether their own leader could survive the storm. Many feared that defending him would make them complicit, tying their political careers to a sinking ship. Whispers of a coup turned into hushed conversations about successors. Some MPs quietly tested the waters with journalists, dropping hints of leadership challenges. Others demanded inquiries not to protect Starmer, but to protect themselves. The unity of Labour, already fragile beneath the surface, splintered like glass. Allies turned into rivals, rivals became enemies. The word betrayal was no longer just on the lips of protesters outside, it was being whispered in the corridors of Starmer's own party. For the public, the scandal spread far beyond Brexit. It cut to something deeper, something more dangerous, the question of whether democracy itself had been hijacked. Protesters gathered outside Parliament in growing numbers, their placards sharp and uncompromising. Respect the vote. Starmer betrayed us. Democracy, not deception. Their anger was no longer only about Britain's relationship with the EU. It was about sovereignty, about trust, about whether the people's will could ever again be believed. Even those who had supported remaining in the EU felt the outrage. To them, this was not about reversing Brexit. It was about being shut out of decisions that should have been theirs to debate and decide. The Conservatives tightened their grip on the moment, united for the first time in months. They painted Labour as liars, cheaters, traitors to democracy. Their message was relentless and devastating. We warned you. Starmer lied. Labour betrayed Britain. Populist movements capitalised too, flooding town halls and online platforms with viral speeches. For years, they had said that elites would never respect the referendum. Now their words looked less like warnings and more like prophecy fulfilled. Their following surged, terrifying the mainstream parties who suddenly looked powerless to stop them. Meanwhile, the media turned the storm into a firestorm. News anchors spoke of the greatest constitutional crisis in a generation. Newspapers screamed headlines in block capitals. Commentators asked whether Britain was standing on the brink of collapse. Social media, the engine of fury, drove the outrage further with each passing hour. Clips of Starmer avoiding questions spread like wildfire. Every pause, every hesitation, every expression was clipped and captioned as proof of guilt. The internet transformed his silence into confession. Inside Downing Street, the panic was palpable. Advisors urged Starmer to speak directly to the nation, to cut through the storm with an appeal for calm. But he hesitated. He knew that one wrong word could ignite an even greater backlash. Silence, however, was no longer a shield. It was a weapon turned against him, wielded by his enemies, dissected by the press, and despised by the public. Each hour of quiet looked like weakness. Each day without answers looked like guilt. The scandal had grown too large to contain. It was no longer simply about Starmer. It was about power, trust, and the very balance of Britain's democracy. Could a Prime Minister act in secret? Could he commit the nation to deals without Parliament's consent? Could the will of the people be ignored by elites behind closed doors? These were the questions now thundering across Britain, asked in town halls, shouted in protests, argued in pubs and cafes. The Supreme Court had exposed one scheme, but it had also exposed a deeper fear that Britain's leaders were no longer accountable to the people they claimed to serve. And so the storm grew darker. For every revelation, new whispers followed. For every denial, new leaks emerged. The scandal was not slowing, it was accelerating. And as Britain watched, breathless and furious, one truth became unavoidable. This was not a storm that would simply pass. This was a reckoning that threatened to consume the entire political order. The storm had now reached a point where even the Supreme Court itself seemed to recognise the magnitude of what it had unleashed. The judges, usually cautious and measured, had spoken with words so sharp they cut through decades of political precedent. They warned that Britain's constitutional order had been placed at risk, that the authority of Parliament had been sidestepped in a way that could not be tolerated. To the public, their ruling was more than legal commentary. It was a thunderous judgment that confirmed the darkest fears of millions. The establishment had plotted behind closed doors, and the highest court in the land had dragged that plot into the light. The impact rippled outward with relentless force. Labour headquarters, once a machine of discipline and order, became a fortress under siege. Staffers whispered about leaked memos, about meetings never disclosed, about which shadow cabinet members had known and which had been kept deliberately in the dark. Every unanswered question became fuel for suspicion. Every whisper of doubt became a spark that threatened to ignite open revolt. Labour's MPs no longer asked if the scandal would cost them votes, they asked if it would destroy them entirely. And as those whispers spread, so too did the word that haunted every corridor: resign. The protests outside Parliament grew louder, larger, more defiant with every passing day. What began as a surge of outrage had turned into a movement. Banners rose high: respect the vote. Starmer betrayed us. Democracy first. Crowds chanted with fury that reverberated through the stone walls of Westminster, a chorus of voices demanding accountability. For many, it was no longer just about the secret EU plot. It was about the sense that their leaders had lied, had schemed, had treated their voices as disposable. The anger was not abstract. It was visceral, a wound reopened from the battles of Brexit, but now cutting deeper, uniting both Leave and Remain supporters in one furious demand: truth. Starmer's silence only sharpened the blade. Every delayed statement looked like evasion. Every carefully polished line sounded like spin. Every refusal to answer appeared as contempt. The man who once embodied responsibility now looked like the very embodiment of secrecy. His calm expression, once praised as steady leadership, was rebranded by opponents as arrogance in the face of national outrage. He was no longer in control of the story. The story was in control of him. The Conservatives, sensing their opportunity, unleashed a barrage of attacks. Their message was brutal, repeated like a drumbeat across every channel. Starmer lied. Labour betrayed you. Democracy has been broken. Their MPs, once divided, now spoke with one voice. Populist parties pushed even harder, flooding social media with viral speeches, painting the scandals as the ultimate proof of their warnings. They spoke of betrayal, of treachery, of elites who never intended to honour the people's will, and the people listened. Their crowds grew larger, their voices louder, their momentum unstoppable. The media's coverage only magnified the firestorm. Rolling News did not merely report events, it framed them as an existential crisis. Newspapers thundered with headlines declaring Britain on the brink. Commentators debated not just Starmer's future, but the future of British democracy itself. Talk shows filled with furious callers demanding resignations, inquiries and elections. Every new detail leaked to the press was treated as another nail in the coffin of Labour's credibility. And beneath all of it, ordinary citizens began to ask questions darker than before. If Starmer could make secret commitments to the EU, what else had been decided in shadows? What other promises had been twisted or betrayed? Could any leader be trusted again? These questions spread like poison, infecting the very idea of governance. Trust was crumbling, not only in Labour, but in the entire political system. The scandal had become something far bigger than one man or one party. It had become a reckoning with Britain's democracy itself. And as the fury built, one truth could no longer be ignored. The people were no longer asking for explanations. They were demanding justice. They were demanding consequences. They were demanding change. The fury was no longer just a storm outside Parliament. It had become a tidal wave crashing through every corner of Britain. From London to Liverpool, from Glasgow to Cardiff, the chant was the same: traitor, resign, respect the vote. The air was thick with outrage, not just against Keir Starmer, but against a political order that now stood accused of treating democracy as an obstacle rather than a principle. What began as a ruling had transformed into a reckoning. Protesters filled city squares, town halls and high streets. Families who had never marched before stood shoulder to shoulder with lifelong activists. Old divides of Leave and Remain dissolved into something more powerful: the shared belief that their leaders had lied. Inside Westminster, the silence was suffocating. Labour MPs avoided eye contact, terrified of journalists' questions, terrified of their own constituents, terrified of the collapse they could feel closing in around them. The The word coup was now spoken openly in whispers. Leadership hopefuls quietly manoeuvring behind closed doors. Some MPs, desperate to save themselves, began calling for inquiries, for resignations, for accountability. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to risk their names in a scandal spinning far beyond their control. The unity of Labour, once fragile, now lay in ruins. Suspicion spread like fire in dry grass, burning through friendships, alliances, even loyalty to the party itself. The Supreme Court's ruling had done more than expose a plan. It had lit a fuse beneath the foundations of British politics. Scholars and commentators declared that Britain was facing its greatest constitutional crisis in generations. If a Prime Minister could secretly commit the nation to binding deals, what remained of parliamentary sovereignty? What remained of democracy? Legal experts warned that the court's intervention was only the beginning, that more documents would surface, more evidence would emerge, and more questions would demand answers. And with every unanswered question, the suspicion grew darker, the anger sharper, the crisis deeper. For Starmer, the walls were closing in. His every move was dissected, his every silence condemned, his every word dismissed as deceit. The man who once built his reputation on competence now looked like the very embodiment of corruption. Each headline hammered the same message: betrayal, lies, treason. His leadership, dangled by a thread, pulled tighter each day by enemies outside his party and enemies within it. Allies grew scarce, supporters vanished, even those who had once defended him publicly now stayed silent, unwilling to be dragged down with him. He was no longer the image of strength. He was a man trapped, isolated, waiting for the inevitable fall. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party struck with relentless precision. They demanded resignations, they demanded an election. Their MPs stood shoulder to shoulder, declaring Labour unfit to govern, declaring democracy under attack. Populist parties surged even further, their message simple and devastating. We told you this would happen. The elites have betrayed you. The people must take back control again. Their crowds swelled, their voices roared. Their warnings now echoed across Britain like prophecy fulfilled. The media turned Britain into a stage for crisis. Every channel, every newspaper, every feed screamed with urgency. Rolling headlines declared the nation on the brink. Commentators spoke in apocalyptic tones about a government in collapse, a democracy in peril, a country betrayed. Social media burned with fury. Millions demanded resignations. Hashtags calling for Starmer's downfall trended without pause. Every attempt at defence was drowned out by a tidal wave of fury that refused to be silenced. And through it all, one question echoed louder than any other. If this secret EU plot had been exposed by chance, how many more schemes lay buried in the shadows? How many more betrayals remained hidden behind closed doors? The outrage was no longer limited to one scandal. It was about the very soul of Britain's democracy. By the time dusk fell over Westminster, the sense of reckoning was undeniable. Protesters stood their ground, voices hoarse but unbroken. Labour's headquarters sat in paralysis, consumed by fear. The Supreme Court's judgment had detonated more than a plan. It had blown apart trust in politics itself. Britain was no longer simply angry. It was awake, defiant and demanding change. And as the night grew darker, one truth became impossible to escape. This was not the end of a scandal. This was the beginning of a reckoning. A reckoning that would not end with one man, one party or one ruling. A reckoning that would scar British politics for generations to come.